So this story I like to call Beyond the Ugly Duckling. So once upon a time, there was a swan that grew up as a duck, and he was so ugly that all the other ducks laughed and made fun of him. And one day he looked at his reflection in the pond and saw that he'd become a grown swan with a long, beautiful neck and lovely white feathers. And he was filled with pride and looked at the ducks he was raised with and who had made fun of him. And he now saw them as ugly. He felt better than they, and he swam around with his head held high, preening and stretching out his long, beautiful feathers for all to see. And he started to put on airs and think he was the most beautiful bird around, better even than all the other swans. He became incorrigible, and everyone withdrew from him. After a few years, he saw in his reflection that he was not so good looking anymore. His wing feathers were tattered and a few were missing. His beak showed signs of wear and was not as shiny anymore. His tail had become jagged and gray looking. Distressed, he saw out a wise owl that he had come to know and admire. "Oh, owl," he said, "when I was young, I was brought up by ducks, and compared to them, I thought I was ugly and was deeply ashamed of myself. And then as I grew, I discovered that I was actually a swan and was filled with pride at seeing how beautiful I had become. But now, of late, I've been losing my good looks and I looked old and tatty." The owl looked at him with a slightly quizzical expression and sat silent on his branch for a moment. Then he said in his deeply resonant voice, "Dear swan, your body's growing old, and one day you'll die. And if you're so identified with your body, how your body looks, then you're bound to end your days in misery and unhappiness." Horrified and helpless, the swan looked at the owl and said, "But what will I do? I don't know anything else to be but a beautiful swan, and if I become old and ugly, I'll be useless and no one will love me." The owl contemplated this for a moment and then spoke. "When you were young, you thought you were a duck, and an ugly duckling at that. Now, for those years, you have believed that you were a beautiful swan since then. But everything external shifts and changes. Everything's impermanent. And if you identify too closely with externals, you're always bound to end up with loss and distress. You're no more a swan than I am an owl. These are just passing forms that help give us orientation for a while. You're so much more than a mere swan." The swan looked at the owl hopefully. "What do you mean? I'm way more than a mere swan?" "Well," the owl replied thoughtfully, "the world's a place of definitions. You're whatever you define yourself to be. Your definitions usually come from others around you. If they think you are an ugly duckling, you might think you are an ugly duckling too. If they all agree you are a beautiful swan, then you might believe you're beautiful for a while, until that too begins to change. The truth is that this is all an illusion. What you actually are is your aliveness in whatever form you are using for the moment. The less you identify with the definitions and labels, and the more you identify with aliveness, the more powerful you will become. You look like a swan for now, and I look like an owl for now, but we're both the same on the inside. We're both aware, conscious beings that delight in being alive. We both feel, think, move, and breathe. You and I are the same at that more essence level." The swan was dumbfounded. It was as if his whole world had exploded for a second time. He used to think he was a duck, then he found out he was a swan, and now he was discovering that he was more than a swan. He thanked the owl and returned to his pond, where all the other ducks and swans were gathered. Now he no longer saw the differences, but he saw the sameness instead. He looked beyond the pond to the deer that stood drinking, to the snake that slithered away, to the beaver that dived by his dam, and he saw only aliveness. He was possessed by a deep happiness, a warmth that spread from his heart out through his wingtips and down to his feet. From that time on, the swan became a great and revered teacher. He talked equally with whoever came to him for wisdom and advice, from the lowliest rodent to the great elk and bears who sat around him to learn. He truly was no longer a swan, but a great teacher, reminding others to release their labels, brands, definitions, and identifications. The more he taught, the greater harmony spread throughout that land. And that is the end of the story.